Welcome to CBH. Today we're talking about how newspaper comic strips affected comic books. Newspaper comic strips predate the first comic book by a definite 5 or so decades, and the first comic books were compilation reprints of prior newspaper strips. Comic book stories and choreography evolved from old pulp magazine storylines as well as newspaper comic strips. This episode focuses on some newspaper comic strips, art, plot devices, or characters which predate and likely influence a lot of the more modern comic book stories, characters, and storytelling techniques that we generally hold in high regard. The creators of these strips are Harold Gray, Chester Gould, Byrne Hogarth, Noel Sickles, Lee Falk, Hal Foster, Alex Raymond, Milton Caniff, Frank Frazetta, Winsor McKay, Dick Calkins, and Ray Moore. First, we'll discuss the orphan syndrome of comic book characters, comic book cinematography, some comic characters from strips used in later comic books, various science fiction gimmicks from newspaper strips used later in comic books, and the illusion of change. There is generally a trend in comic books where there are a great many characters whose parents have died and are now orphans. Superman's real parents were dead from planetary explosion, Batman's parents were killed in front of him, and Spider-Man's parents were killed off so he was raised by his aunt and uncle, and so on. There is something interesting about an orphan who grows up without parents and follows their own internal sense of justice to become a person who is completely out of the box and interesting to read about. Carry this into long form of storytelling and we have the developings of an interesting person. Well, before the golden age of comics, newspaper strips did this first. In 1924, little orphan Annie, who obviously is also an orphan, runs into a great many adventures, people, and even criminals, and after establishing herself as a protagonist, takes on and shelters an orphan sidekick dog. She describes herself as an orphan not wanting to let this adopted orphan down, that she is all he can depend on, and they make their own little dynamic duo as well as they at times beat up criminals together. So what we have here is an orphan star of a comic strip who then takes on a junior orphan as a sidekick, and they team up and go through adventure together. In The Origin of Batman 1939 and Spider-Man 1962, their father figure was murdered by a criminal, creating their one-man war on crime. The same thing happened years earlier in 1931 to Dick Tracy in the newspaper strip, which started him off on his decades-long plainclothes squad war on mobsters. This event was the murder-robbery of his fiance's father. 1932, Dick Tracy meets a homeless orphan child thief, takes a fancy to him, and helps raise him. Dick Tracy even goes on to say that this kid, Junior, will be the country's great future detective. Max Collins, who read and later wrote Dick Tracy, implemented Junior's origin into Batman 408 1987 as Jason Todd, the second Robin. Now in 12/24/1939, Tarzan, who was also an orphan and molded by the early death of his parents raised by apes, in a battle picks up a sidekick orphan baboon named Bo Dan, whose parents were also shot and killed in front of him. Both Big and Little Orphan connect in this very touching Sunday. So you have old strips with orphans and eventually orphans starting adopting more orphans. These strips were all before Robin's first appearance in Detective Comics 38 1940 when the orphan Batman adopted the orphan Robin. Senior orphans Tarzan, like Orphan Annie, and Batman became, as the Tarzan strip would put it, the only comfort in a world grown dark with terror. Now the next part we'll talk about is comic book cinematography from newspaper strips. Frank Miller became famous for his use of shadows coming from certain directions with blacks and whites called the chiaroscuro technique in his 1990s Sin City series. However, Jim Steranko used this technique in his 1970s Chandler illustrated novel and has written that Noel Sickles' influence on comics was pioneering this chiaroscuro technique in comic strip form in his early 1930s Scorchy Smith newspaper strip. As far as further interesting comic book cinematography, there is also an interesting mirror scene in a 1940 Sunday strip of Lee Falk and Ray Moore's The Phantom that was astonishingly similar to the mirror scene in the 1973 film Enter the Dragon. Now, when Hal Foster depicted his Egyptian god statue tipping over and crashing down the stairs, he made quite a splash in Tarzan 1933. Well, Alex Raymond would repeat the same effect in Ming's throne room in 1934 in Flash Gordon. This dramatic push of a statue on top of its followers was later used in several Hollywood films. Now, as far as characters being used from comic strips, Penguin is an example, who was created by Bill Finger and Bob Kane in Detective Comics 58, 1941. He was a very characteristic mafia boss who always had his criminal schemes. Well, 9 years earlier, there was an astonishingly similar character called Broadway Bates, who was created by Chester Gould for the Dick Tracy newspaper strip in 1932. The Dick Tracy character, the Blank from 1937, was a blank masked comic strip crime character that bore a very strong resemblance to the Faceless Man in Detective Comics 34 in 1939, and again to Steve Ditko's Charlton character, The Question. The Question was then redone by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons into Rorschach in 1986. Now, to further link the Phantom and Batman, like I've done in the Pulps discussion from episode 3, in the 1936 Phantom newspaper strip, Falk and Moore established that the Phantom's greatest strength is the use of symbolism and superstition to create a false, supernatural, immortal legend of himself in order to induce fear and confusion in his enemies. Using symbolism against criminals, a cowardly and superstitious lot would be something later used by Finger and Kane in the Batman comic in 1939. To further directly link Batman into newspaper strip influence, the Batman body language from the cover of Detective Comics 27, 1939 was taken from Alex Raymond's Flash Gordon in January 14, 1937, and in Detective Comics 33, 1939 was largely taken by Bob Kane from a panel in a 1938 reprint of Hal Foster's 1929 picture strip of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan. Now, before the Red Skull first appeared in 1941, Terry and the Pirates by Milton Caniff had their own villain named the Skull in 1935. This Skull was also notable for always being one step ahead of the heroes with a diabolical plan up his sleeve and wearing a mask to scare superstitious natives. This is the first appearance of the diabolical skull shown here, well before the Red Skull by Ed Herron, Jack Kirby, and Joe Simon during World War II. Since we're on comic characters from newspaper strips, we'll go ahead and add an interesting historical footnote. In 1951, Betty Page's images with bangs started showing up in various men's magazines, before her bondage photos in 1952. Well, it was said that Frank Frazetta modeled Raven Rockette after Betty Page's style in a 1952 daily strip. It is also said that Frazetta's beautiful portrayal of women, especially this one, influenced Dave Stevens in his series The Rocketeer in 1982. Now, as far as dress code of some of these comic strip characters, they were also used for future comic book characters. Here we have some pictures of 1934 Flash Gordon with the star on his chest, and then 1946 Atom Man, and then 1969 Captain Marvel. Now, Roy Thomas once wrote that he modeled the Captain Marvel costume off of Atom Man, who was created by Ken Crossman and Jerry Robinson. There is no direct quote that Robinson modeled Atom Man directly off of Alex Raymond's Flash Gordon. However, it was very clear that most of these Golden Age artists read his Flash Gordon Sunday strip, and the similarity is very strong. Another similar cosmic, star-chested character would include Nova, whom Marv Wolfman and Len Wein designed his costume for their fanzine in 1966. Now, what does the star on the chest of a hero generally mean? Well, maybe this new strip from Little Nemo in 1910 has the answers where it is used on a chest of a policeman of Mars. Evidently, here it shows that a star on the chest has stood for intergalactic law enforcement in comics for more than a century. It has been said that the Silver Age of superhero comic books is more science fiction based, and much of this science fiction has some roots in old newspaper strips, especially in Little Nemo and Flash Gordon. H.G. Wells wrote his Martian science fiction Earth invasion story War of the Worlds in 1898. This story did help in making the word Martian mainstream enough to inspire the amazingly talented Winsor McCay to create a very early comic Martian sci-fi strip in 1910. Little Nemo and his friends travel with King Morpheus' airship to Mars and encounter green Martians. Well, in 1930, Buck Rogers invents interplanetary space travel for a desperate mission to Mars in the year 2430. These Martian comic strips would go on in science fiction comic books like this one drawn by Wally Wood for Weird Fantasy 9, 1951, called The Spawn of Mars. The whole concept of flying to Mars was the entire reason for the space flight that gave the Fantastic Four their powers in their first issue. Reed Richards reveals that in Fantastic Four 2, 1962, with the dialogue written by Stan Lee. There's another strip where Little Nemo and Flip travel to a veritable planet of damn dirty apes found somewhere in Slumberland in 1909. Now, the reversal of species' role in fiction has been a good mechanism for social commentary. However, Winsor McCay did that more than 60 years before the 1970s Planet of the Apes films. Now, talking animals oppressing humans would be a theme continued in 1957 in Alarming Tales 1, written and drawn by Jack Kirby. The concept would be used in the 1968 Planet of the Apes film and again in Jack Kirby's 1973 Kamandi series. Flash Gordon can be considered quintessential in its contributions to further comic books, and that is because Alex Raymond was extremely visually gifted. This science fantasy action hero gatewayed perfectly into a sci-fi action hero, and there are some great carryover similarities between Flash Gordon from 1930s to 1940s and Adam Strange from 1950s to 1960s. Both are blonde masculine heroes from Earth with brunettes for love interests who travel to faraway planets from Earth, defend justice, and save their girlfriends in the process. In 1940, Flash Gordon's strip had a science fiction device called the Maddening Riot Ray, and when fired it would cause everyone in its radius to go mad and destroy everything and everyone around it. In Doom Patrol 96 from 1965 also had a story where invisible waves could drive a planet to riot. And then again in Captain America 193 1976 by Jack Kirby had a similar mad bomb that performed the same frighteningly destructive function. Now, Flash Gordon in 1939 had their very own ice gun villain, Count Mallow of the Northlands. This was quite a many years before Captain Cold in 1957 and Mr. Freeze in 1959. In Flash Gordon 1935, there was a story of Ming's stormtroopers who could withstand fire due to wearing asbestos protecting them from fire. This concept was used a lot with the Human Torch years later with this image from 1962. Hopefully these guys didn't get mesothelioma. Now, before there was Submariner in Marvel Comics 1 1939 or Aquaman in More Fun Comics 73 from 1941, there was Flash Gordon's 1936 adventures in the undersea kingdom of water breathers named Coralia. Flash would gain temporary underwater breathing abilities and fight with an undersea race who were led by Triton and Undina against Ming the Merciless. Our blonde hero would, just like Aquaman in later years, ride giant seahorses, battle undersea octopi, would wear water helmets, and establish armies to invade land. An underwater civilization using water helmets to invade land would be used more than 25 years later in Jack Kirby and Stan Lee's Fantastic Four Annual 1, 1963. On the cover of a 1936 Flash Gordon Strange Adventures pulp magazine, our hero wears an odd pair of boots with the same style that would be used by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby to design Captain America's footwear. The Hawkman in 1935 in the Flash Gordon Sunday would likely be read by Gardner Fox and used as the hero Hawkman in 1940 Flash Comics number 1. In the Power Men of Mongo's story arc in 1940, Flash Gordon wears an electrician outfit that is oddly similar to the revolutionary Flash costume that Carmine Infantino designed for his Showcase number 4 in 1956. And Showcase number 4 is often credited to have started off the superhero Silver Age. Oddly enough, 1956 was also the year that Alex Raymond died in a car crash. When you read comics long enough, one inevitably runs into the issue of the illusion of change. The concept that the character progresses and develops, but does not really change or grow because no one wants to see Spider-Man as a geriatric patient, or Batman getting Alzheimer's, or Orphan Annie as a 50-year-old woman with emphysema. The companies have a brand to protect, so they generally have to keep the character the same, but going through some short-term crisis to keep it interesting. This is the illusion of change, where the character returns back to what they started, and they last for so many years that this illusion becomes really obvious after a while. The one key example that I'll discuss here is permanently crippling spinal cord damage. In 1926, both Orphan Annie and Tony Stark in 1989 got spinal cord damage and told they were never to walk again, but they would walk again within 6 months by miraculous, unconventional surgeries. Long-form storytelling, as in eternally long, tells us that the illusion of change is inevitable in comic books as it was in comic strips. This has been another episode of CBH. This was to function as a brief introduction to newspaper comic strips and how they essentially pioneered a lot of characters, cinematography, plot devices, and the inevitable illusion of change that is currently very popularly received in modern comic books. Cheers, and have an awesome day.